talking about the glory of the Messiah and the first advent of God becoming a man, God tabernacling among us, God taking on flesh, God living a perfect and sinless life as a man, dying for the sins of his people and rising again from the dead, God becoming king, Jesus who was ascended and seated at the right hand of the Father, the one who is bringing the blessings of God as far as the curse is found. This is the story of the advent of the Messiah. We've been talking about the fact that this is a story that God promised long before Jesus even came. There are specific prophecies of the Messiah, prophecies for which Jesus accused his disciples on the road to Emmaus as being foolish and slow of heart to believe, prophecies that are specific as to who he is, when he's coming, where he's going to be born, when he's coming is incredible to me, how he's going to die for the sins of his people, what he's going to accomplish, that he'll bring about the obedience of the nations. There's symbolism and there's depth. There's the story of Abraham and Isaac, and there are all these amazing rehearsals that God had his people doing long before Jesus came. And I often say when I talk about this, I think it's important for us to recognize just how glorious this story is and how it must have been incomprehensible completely to the Jews. All they understand is the basics of where they're at. All they understand is their plight. I mean, at the moment of the Exodus we're in today, the Jews are enslaved. They're under tyranny. They're enslaved under Pharaoh, and they feel like all hope is lost. They understand ultimately little of what we understand today, looking back, as God has promised the Messiah and he's fulfilled all those promises. But what they understand is that they're enslaved. They're in slavery. They're in bondage. They're stuck. And God promises to deliver them from their bondage, their slavery. And so what God does is he has the showdown between the gods with Pharaoh and the Egyptian pagan gods and Moses, who represents the true God. It's interesting when you think about the story of the Exodus, we oftentimes, and I did this as a little boy when I saw the movie about the Exodus, I thought it seems awfully cruel in a way for God to send these plagues into Egypt. It seemed kind of strange, right? You have locusts and frogs and the water into blood and all these amazing plagues. And it just seems sort of over the top in some sense when you're looking at it not understanding history. But when you understand where the Jews were in their bondage, you understand that the Jews were enslaved in a nation that was pagan. They had all kinds of gods. They had gods who were in control of the waters and the crops, and you had, of course, gods in control of the frogs and the locusts and all the rest. And so when God sends his prophet Moses to Pharaoh to say, "Let my people go," he's going to rescue them from their slavery, God sends into Egypt the plagues that their gods were supposed to have control over. So imagine the Egyptians praying to their false god of the waters and their god who is supposed to be in charge of the frogs and the locusts, and nothing's happening. They're stuck. They're exposed for their idolatry. And so God is showing in this moment of the Exodus his victory over the gods of the Egyptians. He's the true God. All other gods are false. Now the Jews are really enduring this. They're living this. They're in bondage. They're slaves. They're stuck. And God promises to deliver them. But how? And so these miraculous things happen in Egypt to demonstrate God's power over these false gods. And then God tells them about the final 10th plague. And that is where God is going to take the firstborn. And this moment is powerful. In Exodus chapter 12, God gives the Jewish people in history things to do to rehearse. Again, I think we need to be honest. They couldn't have possibly understood what all this really meant and how it pointed to Christ. But they're told to take a lamb with no spot and no blemish, a perfect lamb. And they're even told, in the story, they're told not to break the bones of the lamb. So you need a perfect lamb. It needs to be without spot and blemish and don't break its bones. And then they're told to take the blood of this lamb, to put it over the doorpost. And what God said he was going to do is he was going to come with his judgment to take the firstborn in Egypt. And he was going to come in judgment, and on account of the blood of the spotless lamb whose bones were not broken, he would pass over that house in judgment. They would be released from their bondage, their slavery, to enter into the promised land, that relationship with God. That's all they know. They're slaves. They're stuck. God says they need a sacrifice, a perfect lamb whose bones aren't broken. And when that blood covers their house, God's judgment and wrath will pass over them, and they'll be released from their slavery, their bondage, to enter into that promised land of that relationship with God. And then, of course, about 1,500 years later, after this event in history, Jesus, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, Jesus, the spotless, sinless, righteous one, the perfect Lamb of God, goes to the cross at Passover. He's crucified at Passover. And you remember this amazing moment where the Roman guards actually break the legs of the criminals next to Jesus. That's because in crucifixion, there was blood loss, but you typically died because of suffocation. Hanging on that cross, you would have to push up to gasp for air and slump back down again because of the pain and the misery. And you would usually die because of suffocation. And one of the ways they'd speed up the process of death on the cross is they would break the legs of the criminals so they couldn't push up any longer, so their bones would be broken. But interestingly, in the narrative in the Gospels, we see that when Christ comes in his advent and lives this perfect life and goes to die for the sins of his people, when the Romans come to break the legs of the criminals, they break their legs, but they come to Jesus, the Passover lamb, and they don't break his bones, just like God had foreshadowed in the Exodus story. So you have this glorious story told in Exodus. It's real history. This really happened. They were really in Egypt. There was really pagan gods. God really had this showdown, and they were really in slavery and in bondage and needed to be rescued. God was their redeemer. And God told them, here's what I want you to do. Rehearse this. Do this always. And they take this spotless lamb and they don't break its bones. They're careful not to do that. And they put its blood over their home. And God's judgment passes over them. And they're released from their bondage, their slavery. And you see in this the glory of Advent. Jesus says in John chapter 8, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin. But if the Son sets you free, you shall be free indeed. He is the true and perfect Passover. It's his blood that covers us. God's judgment passes over us. It's diverted away from us. We're freed from our bondage to sin to enter into that relationship with God. That's the glory of God becoming King. That's the glory of Advent. That's why it's worth celebrating. The lights, the presents, all of the festivities, the feasting, all of that, celebrating God becoming a man to rescue slaves to sin. That's who Jesus is, and that's why Christmas is glorious. Let earth receive her King. Merry Christmas, everybody.